settle in and let your breathing slow, because out here, night arrives without ceremony. The empty quarter spreads in every direction, and the horizon looks gently erased, like someone smoothed the world with a quiet hand. The sand under you feels cool on top now, even if it spent all day collecting sunlight. Some patches are soft and yielding, others strangely firm, as if the desert can decide where you are allowed to rest. Tonight, you are not chasing adventure. You are learning the simple rhythm of survival. Shade, distance, water, and patience. And if you listen closely, like a sleepless geographer would, you can hear the smallest sounds. Wind, shifting grains, and the long hush of earth exhaling. You might think this is just empty sand, flat and obedient, a simple place. But that is the first polite lie the desert tells you. Even in the dark, the empty quarter is not a blank page. It is a whole library of small shapes, ridges, bowls, slopes, and seams, where the wind has been editing the landscape for longer than your species has had names for things. You learn that survival here is less about courage and more about planning around physics. Sand does not care about your goals. Heat does not negotiate. Distance does not shorten because you feel tired. Out here, you plan around shade. You measure the day by how long you can move without cooking yourself, and you treat every sip of water like a tiny contract with tomorrow. When the last color drains out of the western sky, you notice how the dunes start to appear, not as hills exactly, more like the backs of sleeping animals, lined up and facing one direction. You can feel, even without seeing clearly, that the desert has a grain. It has a texture at the scale of kilometers, a pattern written by repeated wind. In the empty quarter, dunes are not random piles. They are organized because the wind is organized. Not in a neat office worker way, more in the way a tide is organized. It comes back, it pushes again, and it never forgets what it did yesterday. A dune begins with a problem, a small obstacle, a patch of gravel, a slight dip, a hard crust, even a dead shrub from a wetter decade. Wind pushes sand along the surface, grain by grain, in little hops. That hopping has a name, saltation, which sounds like a dance move. It is more like the sand is being flicked forward by invisible fingers, again and again, all day. When those grains hit an obstacle, they slow down. More grains arrive. The pile grows. Then the wind starts shaping the pile, smoothing the upwind side into a gentle slope. The downwind side becomes steeper until it reaches the angle where dry sand cannot cling anymore. Then it slips, and the dune creeps forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a slow animal might migrate while you sleep. You walk on one of these slopes and you understand immediately why maps do not mean much out here. The ground gives way under your foot, then catches itself, then gives way again. Every step is taxed. You climb a meter and the sand quietly returns half of it downhill. It is like walking up an escalator that resents you. Congratulations. You have found the desert's exercise program. The good news is, it is very effective. The bad news is, you did not ask for it. If you keep moving along a dune ridge, you start to feel the wind's preferences. The crest is often firmer, packed by repeated brushing. The lee side, the sheltered side, is softer, looser, and ready to slide. The wind has sculpted a sharp edge, a knife line sometimes, where one side is stable enough to hold shape and the other side is always close to collapsing into a quiet avalanche. And sometimes, if the sand is very dry and the grains are very similar in size and the slope is just right, the dune can make sound. It is not a howl, not a scream, not the dramatic voice people want from a desert. It is lower than that, a hum, a soft vibration, like a distant engine idling under the ground. People call them singing dunes or booming dunes, and it is not a myth. When a sheet of sand slides, the grains rub and bounce in a synchronized way, and the dune acts like a speaker. The sound can roll across the night air and fade into the wider hush. You stand still and listen, and you realize the desert does not need animals to feel alive. It has motion, it has voice, it has routine. The shapes you see in moonlight look permanent, like architecture, but they migrate. Some dunes can move a little each year, sometimes more, depending on wind and sand supply. A route that felt familiar can change. A shallow bowl can fill. A ridge can shift sideways. The desert is always rearranging the furniture. That is why the old travel knowledge here is less about landmarks and more about relationships. The direction of prevailing wind, the position of a star at a certain hour, the feel of a hard pan under thin sand. It is navigation by pattern, not by signpost. Follow one ridge long enough, and you start paying attention to the air itself, because the wind is the real architect here, and you are just a temporary guest. During the day, wind is often born from heat. The sun rises and the sand warms fast, faster than rock and faster than air wants to admit. Warm air expands and lifts. Cooler air slides in to replace it. The desert makes its own small weather, subtle but constant, like a person who cannot stop shifting in their sleep. By afternoon, the world can look bleached. The light feels heavy. Shadows shrink until they barely exist, and you start understanding why shade is currency. In many deserts, and very much here, the difference between sun and shade is not comfort. It is function. In shade, your body can keep up. In sun, it starts falling behind. Heat also plays tricks with distance. You look toward a far dune and the air above the sand trembles. That trembling is a mirage factory. Layers of hot air and cooler air bend light, and the horizon becomes unreliable. A dune you think is close takes an hour to reach. Another one you assume is far turns out to be a small rise. The desert does not hand out clear information. It gives suggestions. At night, things reverse. Sand loses heat quickly once the sun is gone. The top layer cools, sometimes feeling almost damp with cold, even though there is no moisture to speak of. The air settles. Wind can drop suddenly, as if someone shut a door. You feel the temperature slide down, and you understand why desert survival includes both overheating and chilling. The same place that tries to roast you at noon can try to drain you at midnight. And the wind, it wipes away evidence. A footprint in powdery sand looks like a solid fact. You were here. Your weight pressed the grains into a little crater. But a light breeze can soften the edges. A stronger gust can erase the whole thing. By morning, your trail may be gone, or worse, partially gone, a confusing series of half-prints that lead nowhere convincingly. This is why direction matters more than tracks. You choose a line, you stick to it, and you mark it in your mind with bigger things, the angle of a ridge, the position of a distant cluster of dunes, the way the wind hits your left cheek. You learn to watch the sky the way sailors watch water. Survival becomes a short list: water, shade, a steady pace, and respect for the afternoon sun. Everything else is decoration. But the empty quarter is not only sand and air. Beneath it, older stories sit quietly, buried like forgotten pages that the wind has not turned in a long time. You kneel and drag your fingers through the surface, and you can feel how fine the grains are. They slide like dry flour. This is not crushed rock fresh from a cliff. This sand has been worked, tumbled, sorted. The desert is a patient machine that takes rough pieces and refines them. And under that refined surface, sometimes there is something completely different. In some places beneath the dunes, there is hard gravel, the kind that makes a different sound underfoot, a muted crunch instead of a soft sigh. There can be ancient lake beds, flat and sealed, where mud once settled when water lasted longer than a day. There can be rock surfaces, old plains, preserved by a blanket of sand like a tarp thrown over furniture in an abandoned house. Sand collects where the land dips, where wind delivers grains and cannot easily steal them back. The empty quarter is enormous, but it still has subtle low areas, basins that act like bowls. Over long time, the bowl fills. Dunes grow tall. The surface becomes a moving cover, while the older ground sleeps underneath. Sometimes, the desert reveals hints of that older ground. A patch of darker surface where the sand thins. A firmer area that does not slip under your boot. A place where the color changes from pale gold to reddish brown because the grains carry different minerals, or because the underlying material is closer to the surface. And you start to see the desert as layered. Not just space, but time. Each layer tells you about conditions that were different. A period when winds were stronger, pushing sand farther. A period when vegetation was slightly more common, trapping grains and building dunes in place. A period when water visited often enough to leave behind a crust of salt or a smooth sheet of clay. Even in a place that looks empty, the ground keeps records. It is a slow archive. It does not label its files. It expects you to learn how to read. You walk and imagine what it would take to change this place. Not a day of rain, not a week. Something bigger. Something that shifts the whole balance between evaporation and rainfall, between wind and plant cover. The desert feels eternal because your life is short, but the planet has had plenty of time to rewrite Arabia's mood. And if the ground keeps records, then water, rare as it is, leaves the most memorable marks when it finally arrives. Rain here is uncommon, and that is putting it gently. Most days, the sky offers nothing but clean blue and harsh light. Clouds can appear and vanish without commitment, but sometimes the atmosphere finally lines up its paperwork and a storm forms. When rain comes to a desert, it often arrives with drama. Not because it wants to help you, because dry air and hot ground can build intense convection, lifting warm air fast and stacking clouds into tall shapes. Then the water falls in concentrated bursts, heavy drops that hit sand and vanish, or hit harder ground and run. You might be standing in a place that has not seen real rain in months, and suddenly you smell it before you feel it. That smell is mineral, sharp, almost clean. It is the scent of dust getting wet, of tiny particles releasing compounds into the air. The desert smells like cooled stone and fresh clay, like the world has been rinsed. But the desert does not absorb water like a sponge. Not quickly. Some sand can drink it, yes, but many desert surfaces are sealed. A crust can form. Fine sediments can pack tight. In some areas, the ground is so dry and compacted that water runs off, just like it would on pavement. So the water gathers into channels that are usually empty. Wadis, dry valleys, the ghost paths of rivers that only show up when the sky remembers them. For a brief time, those channels can carry real flow, brown, fast, and cluttered with debris. The water does not look peaceful. It looks busy, like it has a list of errands. And then it stops. The flow dwindles as quickly as it began. Water spreads into shallow sheets and sinks. It evaporates. It disappears into the sand where it can, and where it cannot, it simply leaves. The channel returns to silence, as if the whole event was a rumor. If you arrive after rain, you see small miracles that do not last. Tiny plants pushing up, using moisture quickly like they are spending it before someone steals it. Insects that emerge as if they had been waiting behind a curtain. Brief movement in a landscape that usually holds still. Then the sun returns to its job. The surface dries. The green fades. The desert resumes its long posture of restraint. You begin to understand that water here is not absent. It is just punctual in a strange way. It shows up in short, intense appointments and then leaves you alone with the bill. Those short-lived waters remind you of something bigger. Long ago, this region was not always as dry as it is now, and the empty quarter, for all its emptiness, carries that older memory in its buried shapes. If you could rewind the climate, not by years but by thousands of years, you would find phases when Arabia was wetter. Not rainforest wet, not gentle garden wet, but wet enough for lakes to form in low areas, wet enough for rivers to run more often, wet enough for grasslands to spread in places that are now only sand. These shifts are tied to the slow rhythms of Earth's climate system, the way the planet wobbles, the way sunlight is distributed across seasons, the way monsoon patterns expand and contract. Over long time, the belt of rain can move. Winds can change. A region that is dry in one era can be less dry in another. Scientists find evidence in sediments, in ancient shorelines, in the chemical signatures left behind when water evaporated, and concentrated minerals. They trace old lake beds like faint fingerprints. They find that some basins held water repeatedly, filling and drying like a lung. And humans, when they appear in the story, tend to follow water the way iron follows a magnet. In the wider region, traces of past life often cluster along old waterways. Tools, camps, movement corridors. You can imagine people watching the same skies you watch, but with different expectations. They would have seen a land that could support travel in a different way, with more frequent watering points, with more reliable vegetation. The present desert feels timeless, but it is only the current chapter. It is what happens when evaporation wins most days, when plants cannot hold the soil, when wind has plenty of loose material to move around. And speaking of cycles, the sand you sit on did not begin here. It had to come from somewhere. Usually from rock that lived a harder life in mountains and highlands where stone slowly breaks down, one crack at a time. You picture a mountain far away, not the dramatic snowy kind, but a rugged highland under the same sun. During the day, its surface heats. At night, it cools. That expansion and contraction is small, but relentless. Over years, it opens tiny fractures. Add in the occasional rare rain seeping into cracks and drying again, carrying salts that grow and pry the rock apart. Add wind, carrying grit that sandblasts exposed faces. Add time, the great ingredient that never runs out. Rock becomes fragments, fragments become grains. Water and wind take over transportation. When water runs, even briefly, it can carry a surprising load. It drags pieces downhill. It sorts them by size. Heavy stones settle first. Smaller particles travel farther. In a desert, where water is not always there to finish the job, wind does more of the long-distance work. Wind is picky. It cannot lift everything. It chooses certain sizes, usually fine sand and dust, and it moves them in pulses. A gust lifts grains into hopping motion. They strike other grains, knocking them forward. The movement spreads like a chain reaction across the surface, over and over. The wind sorts the material like a slow machine. Finer grains travel farther. Coarser grains lag behind. That is why some dunes feel silky, almost soft enough to pour, while other areas are gritty or mixed with small pebbles. And as grains travel, they change shape. Edges round off. Surfaces get frosted. Tiny marks from repeated collisions. A grain of sand can be a traveler for a very long time, carried from rock to stream to plain to dune, then lifted again, then dropped again. Not once, but countless times. This is slow motion travel. The desert is built one tiny delivery at a time. No dramatic construction crew, just wind doing its job with the patience of something that does not have an appointment tomorrow. Once you see the desert as constant movement, it becomes easier to understand why humans here live by routes, not by borders, and why the smartest path is usually the one that respects the land's quiet rules. You imagine moving through this place with purpose, the way people have for centuries, and you realize how much of it is about knowing where not to go. You avoid the softest sand when you can. You seek firmer ground, the places where the surface crust holds or where gravel offers traction. You choose lines that keep you from climbing and descending too much, because every dune is a little tax on your water. Traditional travel depends on wells, seasons, and memory. Not the casual memory of a street corner, but the deep memory of someone who has crossed the same emptiness and survived. Wells are not evenly spaced gifts. They are rare, sometimes far apart, sometimes unreliable. Knowing one exists is not the same as knowing it has water today. Camps are chosen for shelter, not for views. A small hollow can protect you from wind. The lee side of a dune can be calmer, but you also avoid places that could funnel water if a rare storm hits, because the desert's dry channels can wake up violently. And in extreme heat, the smartest pace is unhurried. You move early when the sun is low. You rest when the light turns brutal. You move again when evening arrives. Resting is not laziness here. It is part of progress. The desert does not reward speed. It rewards steadiness. You learn to notice small signals, the wind shifting direction, the sand firming underfoot, hinting at a different surface below, the way certain dune shapes suggest prevailing winds, and therefore suggest which side will be steep, which side will be kinder to your knees. The desert rewards calm attention, because attention keeps you alive. It also has a side effect. It makes your thoughts quieter. There is less to react to, less noise, less clutter. The landscape is simple, but it is not boring. It is a masterclass in subtlety. And when you lift your eyes from the ground, you notice the biggest guide of all. Above you, the night sky spreading over an open world. The sky does not feel like a backdrop out here. It feels like infrastructure. It is the only ceiling you get, and it is absurdly well furnished. Stars stack on top of each other, so dense you stop trying to count. And the Milky Way looks less like poetry and more like spilled dust you will never finish sweeping. You think the night sky is just decoration, something pretty to look at while you wait for morning. Wrong. It is a map that does not blow away. It does not migrate like dunes. It does not care about your footprints. It simply turns at the same patient rate every night, whether you are ready or not. Out here, with no city glow to bleach the dark, you notice how many stars are normally stolen from you. The dim ones come back first, then the faint haze between them, and then the heavy, crowded parts, where the sky looks textured. In the empty quarter, the atmosphere is often dry and clear, and that clarity makes the stars feel closer than they have any right to be. You lie back against a slope that still holds a little warmth deep down. The surface is cool, but the dune remembers the day. The wind has calmed, or at least it has stopped bothering you personally, and the silence grows so large it starts to feel like a sound of its own. And that is when the practical side of the sky shows up. If you move at night, you move with less heat, stealing your water. You can walk longer without feeling the sun pressing your thoughts flat. Night travel is not romantic though. It is careful. You watch the ridges ahead because the sharp crests can cut your pace. You watch for patches of softer sand because they can trap your energy without warning. And you watch the sky because the sky gives you a steady reference when the ground refuses to. In the northern sky, you look for the star that barely moves. It is not a perfect nail in the heavens, but it is close enough. Everything else seems to circle around it, slowly, like the sky is a wheel turning on a quiet axle. If you keep that steady point where you want it, you can keep a direction, even when every dune looks like the last dune you saw. Other stars rise and set in predictable places, and over generations, people memorize their timing the way you memorize a familiar hallway. Not because they want to sound wise, because in a landscape with few fixed landmarks, the only stable geometry is above you. You also learn something slightly unnerving. The desert makes you good at noticing motion, and the sky is full of it. A faint streak, a meteor, gone before your brain names it. A slow, bright dot, a satellite, sliding across the stars with indifferent purpose. A blinking aircraft, far away. A reminder that the modern world still exists somewhere, even if it feels like a rumor tonight. Congratulations, you have achieved perspective. The downside is that perspective comes with scale, and scale comes with humility you did not request. Because once you stare at the stars long enough, your mind does what minds do. It starts connecting the quiet above you to the quiet beneath you. The dunes you walked today feel ancient. They look like they have always been there, but they are young compared to the ground below them. And that ground is young compared to the rock foundations of Arabia. And those rocks are young compared to the planet itself. Everything you can touch here is temporary, even if it is temporary on a schedule that makes your whole life look like a short yawn. You think you are resting on something stable. Wrong again. The Arabian plate, the slab of crust carrying you, is moving. Not fast, not dramatically, but it is sliding north and a little east, pushing into Eurasia with the quiet determination of a shopping cart that will eventually tap another cart. The collision does not happen in a single moment. It happens as mountains rising far away, as folded rock, as earthquakes along seams you will never see. Even this desert, so still at night, is riding on a moving piece of the planet. And on top of that moving plate, wind keeps rearranging sand, and under that sand, groundwater moves when it exists, creeping through pores and fractures. And above you, the atmosphere rotates and trades heat between equator and pole like a restless animal shifting in sleep. You begin to see the Earth as a system that never fully stops. It only slows down enough to let you pretend. Your camp, whatever form it takes tonight, is a small decision against a very large machine. Maybe you have a tent, maybe just a blanket tucked behind a low ridge to break the breeze. Either way, you pick your spot by thinking like the land. You avoid the lowest places because they collect cold air at night. The desert can make a shallow basin feel like a refrigerated bowl. You avoid the obvious channels, even dry ones, because those are the paths water takes when the sky finally loses its temper. You choose a place where the sand feels slightly packed because soft sand shifts under you all night, and you do not need the ground trying to relocate you while you sleep. The more you pay attention, the more the desert feels less empty and more finely tuned. You notice the way the wind has combed ripples into the sand, tiny ridges, like fingerprints. Each ripple has a gentle windward side and a sharper lee side, the same logic as the dunes, just scaled down like the desert repeating itself in miniature. The wind does not invent new ideas often. It repeats what works, and you notice that even the stars have a geography not of land, but of habit. The bright band of the Milky Way arches across the sky depending on the season, and people who travel regularly know how it will sit, how it will lean, how it will change. You might not know the names of constellations, and the sky does not care if you do, but you can still use shapes, a triangle of bright points, a curved line that rises just before dawn, a familiar cluster that appears above the same dune ridge hour after hour. In a place where the landscape moves, you navigate by what does not, but you also learn to respect what the night hides. In the day, heat haze makes distance unreliable. At night, darkness does the same job. The slope ahead might be gentle, or it might drop off sharply into a bowl. A ridge might look like a solid line, but it may be broken by notches and slips. The desert at night is not trying to hurt you, but it will not cushion your mistakes either. And so, If you travel slowly. You step onto firmer crests when you can, because the top of a dune often has tighter sand. You angle across slopes rather than straight up to save your legs. You stop now and then to look back, not because you are sentimental, but because the view behind you can help you remember the pattern you are moving through. It sounds almost peaceful, and in a way, it is. But the reality check is always there, sitting quietly in the corner like an unpaid bill. You cannot drink scenery. You cannot eat starlight. Your body is a small chemistry set that needs water, salt, and calories, and the desert is not interested in supplying any of those. So, survival stays simple, even under a magnificent sky. Water is weight, and weight is decisions. If you carry it, you are slower, but safer. If you carry less, you are faster, but you are gambling. And the desert is an excellent casino because the house has infinite patience. In the empty quarter, the old logic of movement often depends on known wells and on timing. People travel when the heat is less punishing and when the risk of sandstorms is lower and when there is at least a chance that a water source has not failed. Some wells tap shallow groundwater perched in sandy layers above harder rock. Others reach deeper into aquifers laid down in older climates when rainfall was more generous. That is the strange thing about desert water. It can be modern, falling this year and seeping down, or it can be ancient, stored underground since a time when the landscape had more grass and fewer dunes. You draw water up, and you might be drinking the memory of a wet Arabia, filtered through sand and stone for thousands of years. It tastes different depending on where it comes from. Sometimes it is sweet enough to feel like a gift. Sometimes it is mineral heavy, a little salty, because water that sits in rock tends to pick up whatever the rock is willing to share. Sometimes it is not fit to drink in large amounts, and you learn quickly that not all water is helpful water. In places where the groundwater is brackish, people have always had to adapt, mixing sources, rationing, or moving on. The desert does not just test your endurance, it tests your planning. And planning out here can be as simple as knowing the shape of a tree. In the empty quarter, true trees are rare, but where groundwater sits closer to the surface, you can sometimes find hardy plants that mark it. A cluster of shrubs, a few tougher species that can survive on deep roots. Even the presence of certain insects can hint at moisture below. You follow life because life follows water. It is not mystical. It is just supply chains. If you stay long enough, you start noticing the ways humans have tried to make the desert behave. Some places have modern tracks cut through dunes, lines of tire marks that look decisive until the wind erases them. Roads can be buried by drifted sand in a single storm because dunes do not respect your infrastructure. If you want a road to last, you have to fight the wind with constant maintenance, or you build around the problem, avoiding the worst dune fields when you can. Oil and gas operations exist in the wider region, and they bring their own kind of geography. Not mountains and rivers, but grids, access roads, pipelines, and supply routes. In the day, the heat makes metal shimmer. At night, distant lights can hover low on the horizon, like a small, artificial constellation, pretending to belong here. But even industry is temporary when the sand decides to move. The desert does not destroy everything quickly. It simply adds work. It adds friction. It turns every human plan into something that must be revisited, repaired, defended. That is the relationship humans tend to have with extreme environments, not conquest, maintenance. Speaking of maintenance, your own body becomes a small project out here. You cover skin not for warmth, but for shade. Loose fabric traps a layer of air and slows dehydration. You protect your eyes because blowing sand is not dramatic. It is just constant abrasion. You watch your salt intake because sweating without replacing minerals can leave you weak and confused. And confusion in a desert is a quiet emergency. And you learn that the worst time of day is often not noon itself, but the long stretch after, when the heat has soaked into everything. The late afternoon can feel like the desert is reluctant to let go of its anger, so you rest when it is smartest and you move when it is kindest. This is why traditional desert travel often looks slow from the outside. It is not slow because people lacked ambition. It is slow because speed is expensive here, and expense is paid in water. You start to appreciate the old routes as something more than lines on a map. They are negotiated compromises with the land. They thread between dune seas and rocky ground, between known wells and safer camping hollows, between places where the wind scours and places where it deposits. If you follow one of those imagined routes in your mind, you notice how often it avoids the highest dunes. Not because the dunes are scary, but because climbing them is a tax you cannot afford every day. You prefer the edges of dune fields, the transitions where sand thins and harder ground offers a steadier path. Those transitions are some of the most interesting places in deserts because they show you the desert is not one thing. It is a mosaic. One moment, you are in soft, pale sand that pours around your boots. Then you reach a patch of gravel, a surface called desert pavement, where wind has removed finer particles and left stones behind, like a protective skin. It is counterintuitive, but that gravel surface can actually preserve what lies beneath it, shielding finer sediments from being lifted. You walk on it, and the sound changes from a soft hiss to a crisp crunch. Your pace improves. Your mood improves. The desert is still the desert, but now it is cooperating for a while. And then, with no warning, the gravel ends and you are back in the sand, climbing another slow wave of grains. The empty quarter is famous for its dunes, but the wider Arabian deserts include these rocky faces too, and the boundary between them can shift. Over time, sand can bury gravel, or wind can strip sand away and reveal gravel again. The desert is always editing its own surface. If you keep watching the sky, you might catch thin clouds drifting through, even when rain is not coming. High clouds can smear the stars. Low clouds can form along temperature changes, then dissolve. You start seeing the atmosphere as another moving surface, a second desert above the first one. The dry air steals moisture from you even when you are not sweating. Every breath is a small loss. Your skin dries, your lips crack, your throat feels dusty even if you have not swallowed sand. In more humid places, you do not notice the atmosphere as much. Here, you feel it taking things, and yet there is a strange comfort in the honesty of it. Nothing is pretending to be gentle. The desert does not lure you with abundance. It does not promise you a future. It simply offers you a set of conditions, and you respond. You begin to understand why people can love places like this. not because they are easy, but because they are clear. In the night, the temperature keeps dropping, not forever, but enough to remind you that deserts are defined by extremes, not just heat. With few clouds to trap warmth, the ground radiates its heat away into space. The same clear sky that gives you so many stars also lets the day's warmth escape. Your breath feels cooler. The sand feels colder against your palm. The air seems to thicken, not with moisture, but with stillness. And in that stillness, the desert feels like a lesson in time. You think dunes are the main story, but dunes are just the surface handwriting. The deeper story is the way this region sits between bigger climate systems, and the way those systems shift. Arabia is positioned where subtropical high pressure often dominates, a belt of descending air that discourages clouds. Descending air warms as it sinks, and warm air is greedy for moisture, so it keeps water vapor from condensing into rain. This is part of why deserts exist at certain latitudes, not by accident, but by global circulation. Then you add the seasonal breathing of monsoons. In some periods, the summer monsoon can push farther north, bringing moisture inland. In other periods, it retreats, and the interior dries. Over thousands of years, Earth's orbital cycles nudge these patterns, strengthening monsoons at times, weakening them at others. So, the empty quarter is not just a desert because it is unlucky. It is a desert because the atmosphere has habits, and this is where those habits leave dry footprints. The idea sounds abstract until you realize it affects everything you touch. It controls how much vegetation can grow, which controls how much sand is trapped, which controls how much sand is available for dunes, which controls how easy it is to travel, which controls where people can live. One slow change in rainfall can ripple outward into the whole human story of a region. You can see clues of those past wetter times not only in buried lake beds, but in the way the dunes themselves sometimes sit on older surfaces. A dune field can cover ancient river channels, and those channels can sometimes be detected by subtle differences in the ground or by the way moisture behaves after a rare rain. In some parts of Arabia, scientists have mapped old drainage patterns that do not make sense under today's climate. Channels too large for modern rainfall, networks too developed to be explained by occasional storms. They point to periods when water flowed more regularly, and those wetter periods were not necessarily gentle. More water can mean more vegetation, yes. It can also mean more floods, more erosion, more reshaping. The planet does not do kindness. It does balance. If you had been here during a greener phase, you might have seen shallow lakes glittering in basins that are now filled with dunes. You might have seen grasslands that could support animals, and with animals, the possibility of human travel that does not feel like a siege. But the cycle swung back. It always does. The rains shifted, the lakes dried, the dunes reclaimed the basins. The empty quarter became emptier again. And now, tonight, you are lying under the result of all those shifts, watching stars that have watched it too, indifferent and reliable. The sand beside you holds another quiet detail. Its color is not uniform. In moonlight it looks pale, but if you examine it closely, you can see grains with different tones. Some are almost white, likely rich in quartz, which is hard and durable. and tends to survive long journeys. Some are slightly reddish or tan, carrying iron staining, tiny traces of chemical history. Quartz is one of the reasons deserts can look so bright. It reflects light well, and it resists breaking down into anything else. Other minerals weather faster, turning into clays or dissolving, but quartz persists. It becomes the frequent traveler, the stubborn commuter that keeps showing up. A grain of quartz sand can be older than your entire language. It might have been part of a mountain, then part of a river, then part of a coastal plain, then lifted by wind into the interior. It can be recycled again and again. A tiny, hard witness. You pinch a bit of sand and let it fall. It makes a faint whisper. Each grain lands and settles in a position it will not keep. Because even now, in the night, movement continues. A light breeze picks up, and you feel it first on your face, then hear it on the dune. A soft brushing sound as it pushes grains into new ripples. Wind does not need storms to reshape a desert. It does most of its work in small moments, repeated endlessly. Over time, those small moments build the big shapes. The technical explanation is simple enough to hold in your head without effort. Wind moves sand by rolling it, by hopping it, and sometimes by lifting fine dust into suspension. Rolling happens when grains are too heavy to hop, so they creep along, nudged by impacts. Hopping, saltation, is the main engine of dune building because those hopping grains hit the ground with enough energy to knock others loose. Dust suspension carries the finest particles far away, sometimes out of the desert entirely, into the ocean, into other ecosystems, into the lungs of far-off forests. That means the empty quarter is not isolated. It exports pieces of itself. Dust from deserts can fertilize distant seas with iron and phosphorus. It can change how clouds form. It can dim sunlight slightly in far regions. Your quiet dune field is connected to global systems in ways you will never see directly. Congratulations, you are standing in the middle of a supply chain that includes plankton. And then, because the desert loves a practical lesson, it reminds you of friction again. Walking on dunes is not just hard because of slope. It is hard because energy disappears into the ground. Each step pushes sand grains aside. That movement absorbs effort. On rock, your foot pushes back against something solid. On sand, your foot negotiates with millions of small particles that are happy to rearrange themselves. This is why people traveling here traditionally used animals adapted to it, and why even those animals have their limits. A camel's wide, padded feet spread weight, reducing sinking. Its body tolerates dehydration better than yours. Its eyes and nostrils handle blowing sand with built-in defenses. The camel is not romantic either. It is a walking compromise between biology and geography. Even with that advantage, you still plan your travel like a miser plans expenses. You do not waste water. You do not waste strength in the hottest hours. In the empty quarter, the concept of wasting becomes very clear, very fast. The night deepens. The stars shift slightly. The air cools further, and you realize that the desert can make you shiver even after trying to cook you earlier. If you're lucky, the wind stays low. If you are less lucky, it starts rising again sliding over dunes and stirring sand into faint streams that crawl along the surface. It is not always a full sandstorm. Often, it is just enough to make you aware that the land is never fully at rest. A true sandstorm is a different creature. It can start when winds strengthen over a broad area, lifting sand and dust into the air until the horizon disappears. In some storms, visibility drops so far that the world becomes a small bubble around you. The wind can sting exposed skin. Fine particles find every gap in clothing, every seam, every fold, because sand is nosy like that. In such conditions, travel becomes a bad idea. You shelter, you wait, you let the storm pass. The dunes will still be there afterward, rearranged slightly, and you will have lost time but saved your eyes. Storms also remind you that the desert is not only dry, it is abrasive. It is erosion in motion. Wind erosion happens by deflation, where fine particles are lifted and removed, and by abrasion, where sand grains act like countless tiny chisels, blasting rock surfaces. Over long time, wind can polish stones, carve sharp edges, and shape strange forms. In some deserts, you find ventifacts, rocks sculpted by sand blasting into faceted shapes. In the deep dune fields of the empty quarter, you mostly see the results in the sand itself. But along the margins, where rock is exposed, wind has been working on it for ages, sanding it down with stubborn attention. This is why the desert can look smooth from far away. Wind is a perfectionist. It hates roughness. You do not have to travel far in your imagination to reach another kind of desert surface, a place where sand thins and bedrock appears. There, the landscape is not waves, it is plateaus and broken ridges, the bones of the land showing through. These rockier areas reveal another truth. The empty quarter is a sea of sand, but it sits within a broader geological setting shaped by tectonics, uplift, and long erosion. Arabia has uplands and escarpments, places where rock layers tilt and break. The western edge, toward the Red Sea, has rifting, where the crust has been pulled apart and basalt has erupted in volcanic fields. Far from your current dune, there are lava landscapes, black and jagged, as if the planet spilled its anger and let it harden. The empty quarter feels like emptiness, but it is surrounded by geological drama. And yet, the dune sea still gets the last word, at least on the surface, because sand is mobile and mobility is power. It fills low places. It buries small obstacles. It creeps into gaps. Over time, it can cover roads, swallow fences, and soften the edges of anything humans leave behind. The desert is an expert at making your work look temporary. If you have ever tried to keep a room clean, you understand the feeling. You finish, you step back, and then dust arrives again as if offended by your effort. The difference is that desert dust arrives by the ton. Your thoughts drift back to water again, because water is the only rival that can reshape landscapes as effectively as wind. Even in a desert, water has moments of authority. When rare storms strike, they can trigger flash floods that cut through channels and move sediment far more quickly than wind can manage in the same short time. Water is chaotic and heavy-handed. Wind is constant and precise. In the empty quarter, both have taken turns. The wadis that stay dry most of the year are like sleeping nerves. They look harmless until they are activated. When they flow, they can carry sand, gravel, branches, and anything else left in the channel, pushing it downstream in a sudden brown surge. If you camp in the wrong place, in the path of that sudden flow, the desert does not forgive you. It does not even notice you. The water follows gravity, and you are just another object in the way. So people learn the land's habits. They camp on slightly higher ground. They read channels for signs of recent flow. They respect the geometry of drainage, even when it looks like nothing. This is the practical side of geography, not trivia, not maps for fun, patterns that keep you alive, and the patterns extend upward too. At night, you sometimes see a faint glow near the horizon, not from cities, but from air glow, a subtle atmospheric light caused by chemical reactions high above. It is gentle, almost imaginary. It reminds you that the atmosphere is not empty either. It is layered, active, and always interacting with sunlight, even long after the sun has set for you. The earth is busy in ways you cannot hear. The night is long, but it is not wasted. It is a time for moving, for cooling, for resetting. It is when you can cover distance without paying so much in sweat. It is when you can look up and feel the scale of where you are, which is both soothing and slightly inconvenient for your ego. If you keep traveling under the stars, you start to notice the way the desert changes as the hours pass. Early night can still hold a trace of heat. Late night becomes colder. And sometimes a thin crust forms on the surface of sand in places. Not ice, but a slight cohesion as temperature drops, and humidity, however small, condenses faintly. The sand can feel a little firmer in the pre-dawn hours. Your steps sink slightly less. Then, near dawn, the horizon lightens in a thin band. The stars fade reluctantly. The desert holds its breath for a moment, as if it knows what is coming, because day returns, and with it, the routine of heat, light, and mirage. But before you get there, while the sky is still dark enough for stars, you let your mind widen outward, following the idea that this kind of patient shaping is not unique to deserts. It is just more visible here. Wind shapes dunes the way waves shape coasts, repeating pressure, endless small impacts. Rivers carve canyons by returning again and again, patient demolition crews cutting into rock. Ice scours valleys with the slow weight of glaciers, grinding mountains into powder like a gigantic indifferent file. Different tools, same theme. Time plus motion equals change. And when you finally start thinking that way, the empty quarter stops being a strange exception. It becomes one expression of a planet that never stops remodeling itself. Even when it looks still, you keep walking, and the sand under you feels less like an obstacle and more like a process. You are temporarily inside. The dunes are not scenery. They are the current shape of moving matter, held in place only as long as the wind agrees. Somewhere ahead, the ground may shift again from pure sand to mixed sand and gravel to a hard, flat plain where the desert feels like a different instrument entirely. And in that change, you can read another chapter of what lies under your feet, written not in words, but in texture. The first thing you notice on that harder plane is the sound. Your steps stop whispering. They start clicking or crunching, depending on what the surface is made of. After hours of soft sand absorbing everything you do, The ground suddenly gives you your effort back. It feels almost rude, like the desert has been letting you struggle on purpose. This is what happens when the dunes thin out and you hit older ground, a surface that has been sitting here long enough to develop a skin. Sometimes it is gravel scattered like spilled beads. Sometimes it is a tight mosaic of stones, fitted together by wind and time. People call it desert pavement, and it is basically the desert's way of saying, enough loose material, I have swept the dust away and left the heavy pieces behind. You might think the stones were placed there by water. Wrong. Water would sort them more neatly. Wind does this differently. Wind steals the finest particles first, lifting dust and fine sand and carrying it off. The bigger pebbles are too heavy to fly, so they stay. Over a long time, the surface becomes armored, a protective layer that shields whatever is underneath from getting picked apart further. Congratulations, you have found a landscape that looks stable. The bad news is that it became stable by being stripped. When you walk across it, you feel the temperature change too. Rock and gravel hold heat differently than loose sand. In the day, these surfaces can feel like they are radiating stored sunlight straight into your bones. At night, they cool fast and hard, as if they resent having been warmed at all. And because this surface is firmer, it also preserves evidence better, at least until the next wind event. A faint tire track might last longer here than it would in powdery dunes. An animal's prints can remain crisp, pressed into fine sediment between stones. But even here, nothing is permanent. Dust will settle. A gust will skim it clean. The desert keeps the records it wants to keep. As you keep moving, the plain begins to show gentle changes in color, not dramatic, not cinematic, just enough to notice. A patch of darker pebbles, then lighter sand again. A thin crust that looks faintly glossy under moonlight. It is easy to mistake it for moisture. It is usually salt or a hard mineral layer left behind when water came through long ago and then left, doing what it always does, arriving briefly, then abandoning you with geology. In places like this, the ground can be cemented just below the surface. Calcrete, gypsum crusts, salty pans, different names for the same quiet idea. When groundwater rises toward the surface, then evaporates, it leaves dissolved minerals behind. Over time, those minerals accumulate and can glue sediments together into a hard layer. It is like the desert is slowly varnishing itself. That hard layer matters because it changes how water behaves when it finally rains. Instead of soaking in, water can run. A storm that looks modest in the sky can become a moving sheet across the ground, collecting into channels, cutting small gullies, and then disappearing again before you finish telling yourself it happened. So even on a flat plain, you are still walking through a system that is prepared for sudden drama. It just prefers to schedule it rarely. And now, as the first thin light starts to build far off at the edge of the world, you realize something else about hard ground. It makes distance feel different. In dunes, every horizon is a suggestion. On a plain, the horizon becomes a line again. You can see farther. You can judge shapes more easily. Your mind relaxes just slightly, and that is when the desert likes to remind you that the sky is not required to cooperate, because the wind returns in the morning more often than you would like. It does not arrive like a wall. It arrives like a habit, A soft push at first, brushing your cheek, then a steady flow that finds every loose particle and starts the long work of moving it somewhere else. Wind does not need your permission. It doesn't even need you to be awake. It simply resumes. On hard ground, the wind's work becomes visible in a different way. Instead of dunes shifting, you see thin veils of dust moving along the surface, little ground-hugging streams sliding around stones, pooling briefly behind small obstacles, then spilling onward. It is like watching the desert breathe close to the floor. If you stop and look carefully, you can see the direction of travel in tiny details. Dust accumulates on the downwind side of pebbles. Small ripples form in patches of sand trapped between rock. Even the way a thorny shrub leans can reveal the prevailing push. This is the kind of information the desert offers. Quiet, practical, and easy to miss if you are busy dreaming of somewhere else. And because you are you, out here, you start thinking about how people have tried to make this place legible. Not in the romantic sense, in the survival sense. In the sense of turning emptiness into a route you can repeat. In dunes, you navigate by star and wind and pattern. On plains, you navigate by edges, the places where one surface becomes another. The margin of a dune sea, the line where gravel begins, the subtle rise where drainage changes. These transitions matter because they tend to be more consistent than individual dunes. Dunes migrate, but a basin edge, a bedrock rise, a long strip of firmer ground, those are slower to change, and humans have always preferred negotiating with slow things. So the old routes, the ones that lasted, often thread along these boundaries. Not because people loved boundaries as an idea, but because boundaries are easier on the body. A caravan does not want to climb unnecessary sand mountains. It wants level travel, fewer surprises, and known water. And the water, always the water. You can go a long time in this region without seeing any surface water at all. That does not mean it is absent. It means it is hidden, and sometimes it is old enough to be counted as a fossil. Under parts of Arabia, there are deep aquifers, water stored in porous rock layers, often sandstone, that soaked up rain during wetter climates thousands of years ago. Back when monsoons pushed farther inland, back when lakes filled, back when vegetation held soil and slowed evaporation, that water seeped down and became trapped under less permeable layers like shale or dense limestone. It sat there, quiet under pressure, while dunes formed above it like a moving blanket. Then humans arrived with drills and pumps and modern impatience. In some places, the desert blooms in the most surreal way. Circles of green farmland seen from the air because irrigation systems pull groundwater up from deep layers and spray it across fields. It looks like someone has pasted a different biome onto the sand. Wheat, alfalfa, vegetables, growing under the same sun that would normally erase them in days. The circles are so neat because the irrigation pivots rotate, spraying in a perfect radius. Geometry becomes agriculture. The desert, briefly, becomes productive, but only because you are spending an ancient savings account. That is the reality check tucked under the pretty aerial images. Fossil water does not refill quickly under today's climate. You can drain in decades what took thousands of years to store. The land will not stop you. The wells will just get deeper, the pumps stronger, the water saltier, until the math stops working. Congratulations, you found a way to farm the desert. The bill arrives slowly, and then all at once. Even without industrial farming, wells have always been the anchors of life here. A well is not just a hole, it is a point of gravity. Routes bend toward it, camps form around it, stories stick to it. In a landscape where so little is fixed, a reliable well becomes a kind of landmark that the wind cannot move. But reliability is a dangerous word. A well can silt up, sand can drift into it, the water table can drop, a season can fail, and because this is a desert, you do not get many warnings that feel polite. Your warning is that the bucket comes up lighter than it should. So you learn to treat every known water source with respect and every unknown source with suspicion. Brackish water can dehydrate you faster if it is too salty. Mineral-heavy water can upset your body when you are already stressed. Even good water, taken too quickly, can make you sick if your body has been rationing for too long. Survival is simple, but it is not forgiving. And as you move deeper into morning, you begin to understand how the day will be arranged, not by your preferences, but by physics again. The sun climbs, the air warms, the wind shifts slightly. As heating changes pressure patterns at the surface, the desert starts to shimmer in the distance, not because it is magical, but because hot air bends light and turns the world into a soft illusion. The horizon blurs. Far objects float. A dune line can look like water. A low plain can look like a pale lake. Mirages are honest in their own way. They are not hallucinations. They are optics. They are what happens when the atmosphere stacks temperatures like layers, warm at the bottom and cooler above, and light rays curve as they pass through. The desert is not showing you fantasy. It is showing you how unstable air can be. And it matters because it messes with your instincts. Your brain wants to measure distance by clarity, but the desert makes clarity unreliable. A ridge can look close because it is sharp against the sky, but it might take hours. A feature can look far because it is washed out, but it might be right there. You learn to stop trusting your first impression. You learn to measure time by effort instead. This is also why people used to travel with experienced guides who could read more than the eyes could. They read wind. They read sand firmness. They read the shape of the land in ways that did not depend on perfect visibility. A guide is not just a person who knows the route. A guide is someone who knows what the desert tends to do when it is trying to mislead you. And then, as the day strengthens, you start thinking again about rain, because in a place like this, rain is not just weather. It is an event with consequences. When the storm finally comes, it often comes from the margins. Moisture can drift in from the Arabian Sea, or the Red Sea, or the Persian Gulf, depending on season and patterns. The empty quarter itself is far from easy moisture, and the atmosphere above it often discourages rising air. But occasionally, the setup breaks. A trough passes, a convective system builds, clouds rise taller than you expect over a landscape that usually gets none. You watch the sky go from blank blue to something with depth. The light changes. The wind smells different, not wet yet, but less baked. Then the first drops hit, heavy enough to leave dark spots on the sand. that vanish almost immediately. If the rain is light, the desert just drinks what it can and moves on. But if it is heavy, the desert becomes briefly organized by water. The wadis, the dry channels, start doing their old job again. Water collects from a wide area, flowing downhill toward low basins. Because vegetation is sparse, there is little to slow the runoff. Because the ground can be crusted, infiltration can be limited at first, so you can get flash floods that move fast, carrying a lot of sediment and making a sound you do not expect in a desert. A rushing, cluttered roar, as if the land is suddenly crowded. And the strange part is how quickly it ends. A flood can roar through for minutes or an hour or a few hours, depending on the storm and the basin size. Then it dwindles. It spreads thin. It sinks into sand. It evaporates. You are left with damp patches, fresh debris lines, and a channel that looks the same as it always did. Except now it has rearranged itself slightly, carved a bit deeper, deposited a bar of sand here, scoured a bend there. Water is impatient, but it leaves strong handwriting. After rain, the desert smell changes in a way your brain remembers. Petrichor is the word people like, but you do not need the word. You just need the sensation. Dust turned to damp, minerals waking up cooled stone. The air feels briefly clean, like it has been washed. And then the sun returns and the cleaning ends. But in that brief window, the desert does something almost theatrical. It tries life again. Tiny plants germinate fast because they have evolved to treat moisture like a limited time offer. Seeds can sit dormant for years, waiting for the right amount of water at the right temperature. When it happens, they sprout quickly, flower quickly, and seed quickly. Racing the evaporation clock, you can see a faint green tint in places that were beige the day before. Not everywhere, but enough to make you question your memory. Insects respond just as fast. Ants emerge to harvest what they can. Beetles move with sudden purpose. Sometimes you see tracks in the damp sand, delicate lines and dots. A lizard might appear, not because it likes you, but because it likes the insects that like the plants. Even birds can appear, as if the sky has been watching and finally decided the desert is worth a visit. But the green does not last. It fades as the surface dries. The plants either complete their cycle or fail. The insects retreat to burrows or die. The desert returns to its default setting, not because it is cruel, but because evaporation is relentless here. And that short burst of life is a clue, a reminder that this place is not permanently dead. It is simply operating on a schedule most creatures cannot afford. If you follow that clue backward in time, the schedule looks different. There were periods when rain came more often. Not constant, not gentle, but frequent enough that lakes formed and stayed for a while. Scientists call some of these phases Green Arabia, and the phrase sounds like marketing, but the evidence is real. Lake sediments, fossil shorelines, old river channels, pollen records, even stone tools found in places that would be hard to justify under today's dryness. The cause is not mysterious, just slow. Earth's orbit is not a perfect circle, and Earth's axis wobbles and tilts over long cycles. Those cycles change how sunlight is distributed by season. When Northern Hemisphere summers get slightly more solar energy, monsoons can strengthen and push farther inland. Arabia can catch more moisture, lakes fill, vegetation spreads, animals move, humans follow. Then, as the orbital cycles shift again, the monsoon retreats. The lakes dry, the plants thin, the wind gets more loose material to work with. Dunes expand and migrate. The landscape rewrites itself into what you see now. This is why the desert feels eternal, but is not. It is a phase, a long phase, longer than a human lifetime, but still just a chapter in a climate book that keeps being revised. And if you are quiet enough in your own head, you can almost feel how strange that is. The idea that the most empty place on the peninsula once held water that reflected clouds, that people and animals once walked where you now see nothing but sand waves, that the desert is not the opposite of life. It is what happens when the balance shifts. It makes you reconsider what you mean by normal. Normal is just what the planet is doing lately. And, speaking of lately, you can find the past even in the present surface, if you know what to look for. Some dunes hide older ground, yes, but sometimes the wind scours dunes away and exposes patches of compacted sediment, hard, flat, faintly cracked. You might see polygon patterns where mud once dried. You might see salt crystals glittering in the morning light, like the ground has dandruff. You might even find small stones that look out of place among sand, rounded pebbles, the kind that usually come from water transport. Not proof by itself, but a hint, a whisper of a time when water had more authority here. And then, you remember, sand begins as rock, which means the desert is connected to the highlands and mountains that seem like a different world. Far to the west, the Arabian Plate rises into ranges where air cools enough to condense moisture. Orographic rainfall, that is the formal term, air forced upward by mountains, cooling as it rises, dropping precipitation. It is the same idea that makes one side of a range wetter than the other, the same idea that creates rain shadows, the same idea that turns some interiors dry while coasts stay greener. Those mountains feed wadis. The wadis feed plains. The plains feed dunes. Even when you are surrounded by sand, you are still downstream of rock. Weathering breaks stone down in multiple ways. Thermal stress cracks rock as it expands in heat and contracts in cold. Salt weathering pries grains apart as salty water seeps into pores and evaporates, growing crystals that push from within. Occasional torrents grind fragments together, rounding them, breaking them smaller. Wind abrasion sands surfaces down, especially on exposed ridges. Over long time, fragments become sand-sized. Quartz survives the longest, so it accumulates. Feldspars and other minerals break down into clays. Iron stains, grains red or tan. Gypsum and salts form crusts where water evaporates. The desert is not just a pile of random grains. It is the end product of many selective processes. It is like a factory that takes mixed raw material and outputs sorted particles, then arranges them into dunes based on wind direction and supply. And you, walking through it, are basically touring the warehouse. The day grows hotter now. The air starts pressing down again. The hard plain begins to glare in sunlight, and you find yourself missing the softer texture of dunes, even though dunes made you work harder. At least dunes do not reflect light quite so aggressively. At least dunes offer hollows where you can steal a thin slice of shade. So you angle back toward lower ripples of sand, toward a place where the surface becomes less armored and more mobile again. The transition is subtle. A few more grains here, a few fewer stones there, until your boots start to sink slightly and the world returns to quiet hissing underfoot. This is the desert's way, constantly shifting between surfaces, constantly making you adjust. If you travel with any kind of load, you learn quickly that the ground type matters more than distance. 10 kilometers on firm gravel can feel easier than 3 kilometers across soft dunes. Your water planning has to account for terrain, not just a line on a map. And because the desert is not impressed by your plans, it offers you another lesson: orientation. In dune fields, especially large ones, it is easy to become disoriented because every ridge can resemble the last. The human brain likes unique landmarks. The desert prefers repeating patterns. That mismatch is where people get into trouble. So you learn to build your own system. You pick a bearing using the sun early in the day. Before heat haze makes everything waver, you note the wind direction and how it changes. You watch the shape of dunes, the gentle windward slope, the steep lee face. You remember that in many dune types, the steep face points downwind, so it can tell you where the wind usually goes. You also learn that dunes come in different forms, depending on wind regimes and sand supply. Barchan dunes, for example, are crescent-shaped and often form where wind blows mostly from one direction and sand is limited. The horns of the crescent point downwind. If you see a field of these, you can read the wind like a compass. Linear dunes, long ridges, form where winds alternate between two directions, or where sand supply and surface conditions favor stretched shapes. Star dunes, the giants, can form where winds come from multiple directions over the year, building pyramidal mounds with several arms. They can be huge, and they tend to grow more upward than forward. The empty quarter contains some massive dune systems, including star dunes that can reach heights that make your legs feel personally insulted. But even those giants are built by small, repeated movements, grain by grain, slip face by slip face. In the day, you avoid climbing these if you can, because every meter up costs more than it should, and on the other side, going down is not always a relief. Descending steep dunes can be a slow slide, a careful dance to keep from tumbling. The sand can run under you, turning your feet into unreliable tools. And yet, the crest is tempting because the view can be clarifying. From a high ridge, you can see the pattern of the dune field, the way ridges align, the way corridors open between them, the way some areas are smoother and others more chaotic. You can pick a route that follows the lines instead of fighting them. You can move along inter-dune corridors, the lower spaces between dunes, where sand may be firmer, sometimes compacted, sometimes revealing the underlying surface. Interdune areas can be important because they are where water might linger briefly after rain. They can also be where salt crusts form if water evaporates there. In some deserts, interdune flats become hard pans, almost like natural floors, until the wind covers them again. So you learn to treat the desert like a terrain of options, not a uniform sea. You stop saying, "It is all sand." You start saying, "This sand is soft here, firmer there, crusted there, mixed with gravel there. The landscape becomes more detailed as your attention sharpens. That attention is not romance. It is how you keep your water. By midday, you are looking for shade again, because the sun is now doing what it does best, turning the surface into a light-powered furnace. Shade can be hard to find in dunes unless you create it, behind a ridge, under a low overhang of compacted sand, beside a vehicle if you have one, or simply by using cloth, a tarp, anything that interrupts direct sunlight. The desert teaches you that shade is not about comfort. Shade is about reducing your body's workload. In direct sun, your cooling system has to work harder. You sweat more. You lose water faster. Your heart rate stays higher. Your thoughts can get dull and sticky. In shade, even warm shade, the system calms down. So you plan around it, as always. And if you are traveling with others, you learn another quiet social geography. You do not waste each other's energy with unnecessary decisions. You agree on the next point. You keep the pace steady. You avoid ego arguments. The desert does not care who is right. It only cares who has water left. Even your gear becomes part of geography. Fabric choices, head covering, how you store water to keep it cooler, how you protect it from contamination by sand. Sand is not just outside you, it tries to join you. It gets into lids and threads and zippers. It finds its way into food. It grinds between teeth. You stop treating sand as a background. You treat it as a participant. And then, sometimes, you see something that looks like a miracle. A small patch of shrubs, a lone acacia-like shape, stubborn and thin, a cluster of plants in a shallow depression. It does not mean there is a stream nearby. It does not mean there is a spring. But it can mean the groundwater is closer to the surface, or that water collects there after rare rains and lingers a little longer. In deserts, plants are honest indicators. They do not grow for fun. They grow where the math works. If you approach, you see how they survive. Small leaves to reduce water loss, waxy coatings, deep roots, thorns, because everything else is hungry too. Even in a desert that looks empty, life competes hard wherever it can exist. And if you dig just a little, you might find dampness deeper down than you expected. Not always, not reliably, but enough to remind you that the desert surface is not the whole story. Below, there can be moisture moving slowly, stored in pores, trapped between layers, creeping along gradients. The desert is dry on top, but not always empty underneath. That hidden water is also what makes certain human settlements possible at the margins. Oases, where groundwater reaches the surface. Places where a spring emerges because geology forces it out. A permeable layer meets an impermeable layer. Water traveling underground is pushed up, and suddenly you have palms and shade and agriculture in a place that should not allow it. Oases are not magical. They are plumbing. But when you arrive at one after days of sand and glare, it feels like the planet has made a mistake. Date palms rise in tight clusters because people plant them that way, because palms create a microclimate under their canopy. Shade reduces evaporation. Under palms, you can grow other crops, a layered system, old and efficient. Water is channeled carefully. Every drop is assigned. The oasis is a human response to desert rules, not and escape from them. It is still fragile. It still depends on water continuing to exist. And in modern times, many oases face pressure from pumping, from development, from the same ancient savings account being spent faster than it refills. Even the places that look like refuge are on a timer. If the water is fossil, that thought follows you as you leave the shrubs behind and return to open sand. You begin to notice the sky again, not for stars this time, but for the way the atmosphere stacks heat. The horizon shimmers harder now. The sun is high and merciless. The wind carries tiny particles that tick against your clothing. Your world narrows to the next ridge, the next firm patch, the next decision about when to stop. And then, in the middle of that harsh simplicity, you remember the longer view, that the desert itself is not permanent. Not in deep time. In deep time, coastlines move, seas open and close, plates collide. The Red Sea rift widens slowly, pulling Arabia away from Africa. The Arabian plate continues its slow shove into Eurasia, contributing to mountain building and seismic zones far to the north. The Persian Gulf is a shallow basin that has filled and emptied repeatedly with sea level changes. Even the Sahara, across the water, has pulsed between green and dry many times. Deserts are not fixed features. They are expressions of climate, and climate is a moving target. So when you look at the empty quarter, you are not seeing a final state. You are seeing a current balance. Wind supply, sediment availability, rainfall scarcity, evaporation dominance. Change any of those, and the dunes respond. A wetter phase could stabilize sand with vegetation. A drier phase could expand dune fields. Stronger winds could reshape dune types. Even a slight shift in storm tracks could change where rare floods occur, carving different channels under the sand. The land is patient, but not static. And now, as the afternoon approaches its peak and you decide wisely to reduce movement, you find a place where the dune slope offers a thin strip of shade. The shadow is not cool exactly, but it is less aggressive. The sand here feels firmer, packed by past winds. You sit where the ridge breaks the breeze, and you listen. The soundscape is minimal, a faint hiss of grains moving, the occasional soft collapse of a small slip face, like someone gently exhaling into a pillow. Far off, maybe nothing at all. This is when the mind tends to wander. And out here, it often wanders into time. You picture the region during a greener interval again. You picture shallow lakes and basins. The lakes would have attracted animals, and animals would have left tracks, and tracks would have become paths. Humans would have followed those paths. They would have camped near water, and their tools would have fallen into sediment, and those sediments would later dry and be covered by sand. Then, wind would erase the surface clues, and the story would go quiet, until someone much later finds a stone tool where it should not be, and realizes the desert has been switching masks. That is one of the strange comforts of geology. It does not care about your moment. It cares about accumulation. A lake bed does not need witnesses to form. A dune does not need applause to migrate. A climate shift does not need anyone to name it. It happens, and the evidence remains, waiting for a curious species to show up and feel unsettled. And speaking of unsettling, humans have a habit of underestimating deserts because they look simple. A dune is just sand. A plain is just gravel. The sky is just blue. But simplicity is not safety. Simplicity is exposure. In forests, you can get lost and still find water sometimes. In mountains, you can shelter behind terrain. In deserts, the lack of clutter means the forces hit you directly. Sunlight, wind, distance, dehydration. There is no softness in the system. The desert's danger is not monsters. It is math. How far can you walk before you run out of water? How long can you stay in sun before your body overheats? How many hours until night cold becomes a problem if you are damp with sweat? How quickly can a storm turn a dry channel into moving water? How many days until a small mistake becomes irreversible? This is why traditional knowledge here is so focused on avoiding mistakes rather than fixing them. You do not improvise your way out of dehydration easily. You do not wing it when you are far from wells. You do not argue with the afternoon. So you wait, and the afternoon passes in slow increments. When the sun finally begins to lean, the desert changes tone again. Shadows lengthen. The glare softens. The air becomes marginally less punishing. The dunes regain texture, ripples becoming visible again instead of washed out. The world returns to contrast. This is when movement becomes reasonable again. And you stand, and you feel how the sand has cooled slightly under the surface. The top layer is still warm, but not scalding. The wind becomes more consistent, not necessarily stronger, but steadier. As the day's chaotic heating relaxes, you start walking again, choosing a line that follows the curve of dunes rather than climbing every crest. You move along a corridor where the sand is slightly firmer, maybe because it is sheltered from constant deposition. You aim for a low saddle between ridges because it costs less. And as evening approaches, the desert begins preparing its nightly inversion. Warm ground giving up heat, cool air sinking, the surface cooling quickly. The first stars appear again, faint at first, then sharper as the sky darkens. And because the desert never misses a chance to be consistent, the night starts to feel like a familiar room you have returned to. Quiet, open, and large enough to swallow your sense of importance. Under that returning sky, you think again about routes and why borders mean so little here. A border is a line humans draw. A route is a line the land allows. In a dune sea, the land allows certain corridors more easily than others. It allows movement along firmer edges. It allows travel between known water points. It allows passage in seasons when temperatures are survivable. That is why the history of movement here is full of corridors, not grids. And even now, with modern vehicles and satellite navigation, the land still has its vote. A vehicle can bog down in soft sand like it has stepped into glue. Tires spin, heat builds, engines strain, and suddenly you are spending fuel and water to undo one bad choice. People traveling in dunes lower tire pressure to increase surface area like a camel's broad foot. They carry traction boards. They travel in convoys. They plan carefully. Because even with technology, you are still negotiating with grain size and slope angle. And that negotiation becomes especially obvious when the wind rises. You can have a clear, calm evening, and then a steady wind begins, pushing sand into motion. Fine grains drift along the surface. Larger grains hop. The dunes whisper. In some places, a slip face collapses in a soft hiss. If you are near a singing dune, you might even catch that low hum again, like the desert is quietly tuning itself. It is eerie, but not threatening. Cozy in a geological way, like listening to an old house settle at night. Except the house is an entire region of moving sediment. You keep walking until you find a reasonable place to pause again. A lee-side hollow sheltered from the wind. The sand here feels softer, but calmer. You sit and you look out across the dune shapes under starlight, and your mind, being stubborn, keeps pulling the thread outward, beyond Arabia, beyond this desert, to the idea that the same patient forces are working everywhere, because the wind that moves dunes is just one kind of transport. Water moves sediment too. Ice moves it. Gravity moves it. The planet is basically a conveyor system for rock, breaking it down, moving it, sorting it, and redepositing it in new forms. A mountain is not an object. It is a phase in rock's journey. A grain of sand that sits beside your boot tonight might someday be part of a beach if it is carried by wind to the coast, then moved by waves along shore. Or it might be buried and lithified, turned into sandstone over millions of years, then uplifted again, then eroded again, becoming sand twice in one long life. Deep time has no issue with repetition. And when you think about that long enough, you start noticing how deserts connect to coasts in surprising ways. Not geographically close necessarily, but process-wise. Waves are like wind with water weight. They arrive again and again, pushing, pulling, sorting. They build sandbars. They carve cliffs. They move beaches sideways along coasts. They do not need storms to work. Those storms speed things up. They are patient. Rivers are like roads for sediment. They pick up grains from mountains and carry them downhill. In floods, they carry more. In droughts, they slow. They meander, cutting into one bank, depositing on the other, moving their channels like living things. A river is not a line. It is a shifting zone of work. Glaciers are like slow bulldozers, pushing and grinding. They carve U-shaped valleys. They leave moraines, piles of debris. They scrape bedrock and make fine rock flour, which can make lakes look turquoise when the powder stays suspended. A glacier is a frozen river with patience and weight. The same theme keeps showing up. Motion plus time equals change. And in a desert, because vegetation is sparse and the surface is exposed, you can watch change happen in almost real time. A ripple shifts. A small drift forms. A footprint softens. The work is visible, even if the major results take years. That visibility is part of why deserts feel so honest. They do not hide their processes under trees. They do not cover them with constant rain. They lay the mechanics out in plain sight. And still, you cannot live on mechanics. So you return to the practical layer again, because survival insists. At night, you can travel farther with less water loss, but you also need warmth. The temperature drop can be sharp. Your sweat from the day can cool you too much, so you keep a layer ready. You keep your water from chilling too hard, because cold water is fine, but a cold body is not. You keep your food protected from sand, because crunchy sand is not a flavor anyone actually enjoys. You rest in a place that will not funnel wind directly into you. You avoid the base of steep slip faces Because dunes can shift in small collapses, it is rare for a dune to bury you dramatically in calm conditions. But the desert does not owe you stability. Better to sleep where the sand feels settled, and then the stars do what they do, they turn. Slowly, the sky wheel rotates. Familiar patterns drift. The steady northern point holds its place. The Milky Way shifts slightly. Like a pale river overhead, you feel small, and not in a tragic way, in a quiet way, like being a small boat on a large calm sea. Except the sea is sand, and it wants to move. You keep this in mind as you drift into another stretch of walking, because the desert's nightly routine makes it possible. The sand underfoot cools. The air calms. Your movement becomes easier. In the pre-dawn hours, you reach another subtle change in terrain, a place where the dunes become lower and the surface begins to show patches of compacted ground. The sand is thinner here, and you can feel it. Your boots scrape something firmer beneath. The color darkens slightly. You are approaching another hidden plain, another older page of the archive. And somewhere out beyond it, you know there are places on Earth where the same patience looks completely different, where water does the sculpting instead of wind, where ice does it, where waves do it, where rock itself flows slowly under pressure. But for now, you stay here in the empty quarters' quiet machinery, moving across a surface that is never quite done being built. And you follow the terrain as it slowly changes again, from the soft hiss of deep sand toward the muted, steady firmness of buried ground waiting to be exposed. Here, the surface stops behaving like a liquid and starts behaving like a floor. You feel it in your knees first, the way each step returns a clean, honest push, instead of stealing it into rearranged grains. The sand thins to a skin, and beneath it is something older and tighter, a plain that has been waiting under cover. You might assume you have reached safety, the desert equivalent of solid ground. But solid is a mood, not a promise. This kind of surface often hides a crust, calcrete or gypsum, minerals left behind by evaporating water, slowly cementing the top layer into something that looks dependable. It can hold your weight for miles, and then fail suddenly where the crust is thinner, dropping your boot into powder like a trapdoor. You learn the trick by experience. The hard spots sound sharper. The soft spots sound duller. You shuffle your feet now and then, testing, listening. It is not paranoia. It is reading the room. And the room, tonight, is still the empty quarter. But your mind has already started wandering outward, because that is what people do when the landscape is wide enough. The same patience shaping these dunes has cousins everywhere on Earth. Different tools, same slow insistence. Speaking of tools, water is the blunt one. You imagine yourself at a coast far from here, where the air is wet enough to feel heavy. The shoreline looks calm in postcards, all soft light and gentle foam. But the real work happens when nobody is filming. Waves arrive like repeated questions, asking the land the same thing over and over. Can you hold together? And rock answers honestly, one grain at a time. A beach is not a place. It is a conveyor belt. Sand is picked up, dragged, dropped, then picked up again. Longshore drift is the tidy term, meaning waves hit the coast at an angle and the water slides sand sideways along the shore, like moving furniture without asking. harbors silt in. Inlets shift, dunes form behind beaches, because wind shows up after waves do, always happy to inherit loose sediment. Humans try to freeze shorelines in place, with walls and groins and dredging. Congratulations, you have declared war on a process powered by storms and gravity. The ocean does not argue. It simply works around your concrete and continues moving sand to wherever physics says it belongs. If you follow that thought inland, you reach rivers, the quiet demolition crews with endless overtime. You picture a canyon, somewhere with darker rock and a colder night. The river at the bottom looks peaceful, almost lazy, but it is doing patient violence. Every flood season, it returns with more energy, picking up stones, grinding them together, and using them as tools. Abrasion is the polite word. The human translation is sandpaper, forever. A canyon does not form because the river is strong once. It forms because the river is stubborn for a very long time, and because the land is either rising or the river keeps cutting down to match a lower base level. Some canyons deepen as tectonics lift a plateau. The river responds by carving faster, trying to keep its gradient, like someone constantly lowering the floor while you dig. Then there is ice, the slowest sculptor that still manages to be rude. You imagine standing near a glacier, hearing it before you see it. Not a roar, more a low creak, like a ship settling. Glaciers look frozen and still, but they move, always. They flow under their own weight, deforming like very stiff honey, dragging rocks at their base. Those rocks scrape bedrock into powder, leaving striations, polishing surfaces, carving valleys into broad U-shapes. When a glacier retreats, it leaves a mess behind. Moraines, piles of rubble dumped at the edge of ice. Meltwater carries fine rock flour into lakes, turning them milky turquoise. It is beautiful, yes, but it is also a record of grinding, a landscape sanded down by cold persistence. And beneath all of these, dunes, coasts, canyons, is the slowest motion of all. Tectonic plates, the deep conveyor belts you never feel until they remind you. You are still on one tonight. The Arabian plate is drifting, and the Red Sea is opening like a seam, slowly widening as the crust pulls apart. Basalt has spilled out along that rift in the past, building dark lava fields you could walk on and regret immediately. To the north, the plate pushes into Eurasia, and the stress becomes folds, faults, earthquakes, mountains rising in increments too small to watch, but too large to ignore. Over time, the comforting part is that none of this requires you to do anything. The planet has its own schedule. Your job is just to exist on top of it, briefly, and try not to run out of water. Back in the empty quarter, the night keeps moving toward dawn again, and the plain under your feet starts collecting a thin veil of sand, as if the dunes are trying to reclaim it. Wind carries grains across the hard surface in short hops, and some of them settle in low spots, building the beginning of ripples. It is how deserts expand, not with an announcement, but with deposits so small they feel like nothing. You realize something quietly important. Most landscapes are not made by single events. They are made by habits, repeated wind directions, seasonal floods, annual melt, daily heating and cooling. Geology is mostly routine, just scaled to a timeline that makes your calendar look like a joke. And that is why humans living near extreme places develop a similar mindset. You do not beat the routine, you learn it. In the empty quarter, you time travel by hours, not miles. You move when the air is kinder. You shelter when the sun becomes hostile. You notice that the desert is not empty of information. It is simply stingy with it. The clues are small. The reward for noticing them is that you get to keep going. Now the eastern horizon starts whitening, and stars fade like they are clocking out. The air cools for its last few minutes before the day restarts its glare. For a short while, everything is balanced. Wind low, temperature gentle, the ground firm enough to trust, but not so hard it reflects light into your eyes. This is the part you remember later. When you are back in places with walls and clocks, the desert, for all its brutal arithmetic, gives you moments where the world feels simplified into basics: ground, sky, direction, and time. And it leaves you with a final, slightly sardonic comfort. The dunes do not care if you understood them. The crust under your boots does not care if you named it. The aquifers do not care how old their water is. The planet will keep lifting mountains, grinding them down, and shipping the pieces elsewhere. Tonight, you were just allowed to notice. Somewhere out there, beyond this hard plain, sand will pile up again, and ridges will form like slow handwriting. Somewhere else, waves will be worrying at a cliff, and a river will be chewing deeper into stone. Somewhere else, ice will be dragging a valley wider, grain by grain, with no audience at all. And if you fall asleep here, in your mind, the desert will continue without you, quietly building and erasing, delivering and stealing,